Hi everyone, and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. So I had an incredibly busy few weeks of work leading up to Easter for about a month, so I had hardly any time for booktube or even reading, as well as work. We were actually doing a steps challenge for work as well, so whatever time I wasn't working, I had to be walking, exercise, the absolute horror of it. But that really did get me thinking about what kind of books I like to read at kind of busy or stressful times like that. Like, I suppose in other words, my comfort reads. Comfort reads, I think they sometimes but not always like intersect with your favourite books. So yeah, I said I'd make up a list of what I consider my comfort reads and what a comfort read is. So I think for my comfort reads, like a lot of people, I kind of crave familiarity, both childhood and more recent favourites, as well as new books from series that you're already familiar with. So you're kind of returning to the same characters who feel like friends, no introductions or background information needed, you can just jump in. Another thing that defines comfort read for me is like it has to be fairly short, so you can get that injection of comfort really quickly. And it's also nice then kind of you get to finish a book quickly, which gives you that little bit of achievement feeling, I suppose, which is nice when you need it. And also like strong world building, I suppose, for the escapism aspect. So they're all the kind of things that I look for in a comfort read. So with that in mind, these are my top reads that I kind of return to again and again, or will return to again and again in some instances as my comfort reads. So the first one, I suppose, is a long-term comfort read for me, and it's one of my favourite children books of all time, and that's Goodnight, Mr. Tom by Michelle Magorian. So I've read this book many times, as it's an old copy I have. So it's about this boy, William Beach, who gets evacuated from London during the Blitz to live with this cranky old bachelor called Mr. Tom down the country. And William is leaving like a very hard situation in London, and it's about how him and Tom help each other. And yeah, it's just so heartwarming, and they change each other's lives forever. The next book I'm going to talk about, I suppose, is more of a book series. I'd recommend all the books in the series for this purpose. It's a series I've heard a lot about recently due to the Anne along on booktube, which is nice. It's nice to see loads of people talking about the Anne of Green Gables series by Montgomery. So I love the first three books in the series especially, and I've read them again and again. So I did discover the series when I was small, but strangely enough I only knew about the first one. I didn't know that there was any books after Anne of Green Gables, so I discovered the others kind of in the last few years. But this is my favourite Anne of the Island. Anne is just such a charming and resilient character. Her antics are so funny, the kind of situations she gets into. In the first book, she's adopted as an orphan by this brother and sister called Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert. Now that I think about it, maybe kind of found family is kind of a favourite trope of mine. And then you follow her through from her childhood to when she goes to teacher training college and eventually at university, and all the people she meets and the relationships she develops. Most of the Anne books are in the public domain, so actually whenever I reread Anne nowadays, it's usually on audiobook on LibriVox, a free app to listen to audiobooks. And this reader called Karen Savage reads the Anne books, and she's amazing. I love her versions. I think they're on YouTube as well, so I'll link them down below. So yeah, I'd highly recommend that as a way of consuming Anne. So speaking of favourites, I'd be remiss not to talk about this book, and that's Persuasion by Jane Austen. So I've talked about this book a lot in previous videos, so I won't elaborate much more here. However, it is one of my favourite books of all time. It's definitely my favourite Jane Austen. Funnily enough, there's also a great audiobook of Persuasion by Karen Savage on LibriVox, so I'm a big fan of that reader, obviously. I love all of Jane Austen's books, but the others are a little bit longer, and I've just reread Persuasion so many times, I'm just really familiar with it. So it's a big comfort read for me. I love all the characters, and the plot makes me swoon every time. The Jane Austen screen adaptations are also a huge comfort watch for me, especially, a bit controversially, the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, which I go back to again and again just for its comforting qualities. Speaking of Pride and Prejudice, I had to include this retelling, which is called Fear Stands the Wind by Catherine Lodge. It's my favourite Jane Austen retelling, although I've not read that many in truth. It's so like pleasingly short and fun. So in this retelling, Mr. Darcy is actually Captain Darcy because he is no longer the heir to Pemberley. He's the second son, so he's in the Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. So strangely enough, my love for this book predates my love for the entire period, but obviously I don't know, it was a dormant interest in me until I actually visited Portsmouth and dived all the way in. Anyways, I think this book is really well written for a retelling, and all of the characters I think are accurate enough for me anyways in terms of how they're portrayed, apart from Mr. Darcy obviously has some alterations because he's the second son, so that does change his personality a little bit, but I think it's perfectly acceptable. And yeah, I'd recommend this, just a fun little book, and I love the antics. There's one memorable situation that Elizabeth and Georgiana get into. I love to sit down and reread this just in a single sitting, as it is so short. This is kind of weird, but I love the cover. It's kind of a rubbery feel, so well done to Meriton Press for getting that one so good. So yeah, Fear Stands the Wind by Catherine Lodge. So I'm not a huge romance reader, but there is one on my e-reader that I return to again and again, and that's The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. So I have heard a good bit about this on BookTube, and I'm glad because it's so good. It's kind of a gender-swapped pretty woman, really. So the main character is Stella, and she has Asperger's. She has a bit of difficulties at romance, I suppose. She hires this escort, Michael, who is going to help her become familiar with that world. So yeah, I just love Stella and Michael's relationship. The love story would be enough to make anyone melt, but also just the exploration of Stella's Asperger's and how it's fitted into the plot, and how accepting all of the other characters are of it is so heartwarming to read, and I can't recommend this book enough. Maybe even if you're not a huge romance reader, there's just so much more to it as well. And there actually are, I think, 2 other books in the series, and it's shocking I haven't got to them yet, and I believe they kind of focus on neurodiverse characters as well, and it's actually own voice from the author as well, which is nice to see, so I'll have to get to those at some stage. So the last 2 books I'm going to mention are actually like new enough to me series that I kind of consumed during COVID. They both happen to be set during the same period, Napoleonic Wars. I know everyone is absolutely shocked. So I selected these 2 books at random because I've only read the entire series at once for both of them, and I couldn't really say with confidence which is my absolute favourite in the series yet. During all the COVID lockdowns, like a lot of people, I was working from home. I live out the country, and we don't really have any next door neighbours as such, so I wouldn't see anybody from one end of the week to the other apart from my immediate family, which is hard for everybody obviously, but it also made with the weekdays and weekends kind of hard to distinguish it sometimes. So what I'd actually do is I would have one of these books lined up Friday to start during the afternoon as soon as I logged off my computer, and that kind of really triggered my brain, right, time to finish work and enjoy the weekend. And we were so lucky with the weather on the summer 2020. It's hard to believe it was the year before last, but summer 2020, the days were really nice as well, so I'd sit outside with one of these books and just get lost in another world, which is the whole point of books. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Sharpe. So I think I mentioned this series a few times as well, but Sharpe is one of my favourite characters of all time. By his own admission, he was like born in the gutter. It's about his experiences in the army during the Napoleonic Wars. And the actions are really well described and easy to follow for somebody that's not really familiar with military tactics. But Sharpe as a character himself is definitely the heart of the series, and just kind of the way the other characters react to him is always kind of heartwarming is a weird word to describe for these books, but I found it anyways. And what I love about the Sharpe books is they're so fast paced. Like, I mean, you could sit down and read one of these in like a 5-hour sitting if you want to, and I definitely have done with a few of them. It's so hard to put them down. So yeah, I just love the Sharpe series, and if you're only familiar with the television show, I would highly recommend checking out the books, because yeah, Sharpe as a character in the books is so much more well developed, and yeah, I just love him. So funnily enough, then the next series I'm going to talk about is kind of nearly the polar opposite, even though it's set at the same time, and that is the
Aubrey-Maturin series. So I suppose the opposite is in it's set on the sea and not land, but I don't think anybody would call these books fast paced, which probably reflects life at sea as well. So the Aubrey-Maturin characters of the series title are Captain Jack Aubrey and his ship surgeon Stephen Maturin. And their friendship is just one of the best in literature, I think. It covers every possible circumstance.
hard times, good times, you know, people come in and out of their lives, but they're still constants to each other, I suppose. Yeah, and all of the characters in the books are actually written so affectionately. One of the characters in particular, I suppose, kind of a recurring one is Tom Pullings, and I'm way more attached to him than reasonable for anybody in literature. I think just every celebration they have, you just celebrate with them, and I'd be grinning like a lunatic whenever I'm reading these books, and get then every downfall, it's sad for them as well. You just get so connected to the characters. So like I said, I suppose it's not guaranteed that a lot happens in any one of these books. Like this one is you know, it's about a stowaway, a woman stowaway on one of the ships, and another one I think it's mostly about the sailors putting on a performance of Handel's Messiah. But it just feels like going on a trip with friends. The everyday events of life on board ship are just explained so beautifully, and Patrick O'Brian has been compared to Jane Austen a lot in terms of this language. I can so see that. I've all 20 of the books destroyed with like underlining bits, and I'd say that Jane Austen and Patrick O'Brian are the only two like prose authors that I read out loud to myself, quietly of course, that I read out loud to myself on a routine basis, just because the language is so beautiful and just the turns of phrases are wonderful. Stephen Maturin is actually half Irish, so he says such Irish things, always funny, but yeah, they're just such comfort reads for me. Like, it's just, I suppose it helps that they're going all over the world as well, so you can have a little armchair travelling. And yeah, so this month I didn't have time for a reread, but the BBC years ago did audio dramas of them, and the first 6 are actually in a collection on Audible, obviously abridged, but I listened to the first 3 of those, and it was such a pleasure to return to this world. So yeah, I'd highly recommend those on Audible if you want to sample these. Like, the books are very heavy on the nautical terms, and that takes a lot to get used to, but now that I've kind of got over that stage, yeah, Patrick O'Brian will always be comfort reads for me. So that's it for today. I'd love to hear about any of your comfort reads. Please let me know, and yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for another video.